Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance within the Sumy region and the northern section of the front line. They've managed to advance within the northern parts of Vovchansk. They've also managed to advance across the Sirbis River line on both banks of it. The Russians also managed to advance to the south of Decisive and to the northeast of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians in turn managed to advance to the south of Nadia on the western bank of the Sirbis River line. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to advance to the outskirts of Oleksivka from the north, gain control over the first lines here near the town of Volodymyrivka, which the Russians just captured. They also managed to reach the outskirts of Novomykolaivka. The Russians increased their pressure here in the Sumy region, where they've recently captured approximately 25 square kilometers, mainly over the past 3 days. With this additional advance, the Russians continue their offensive operations. This is to reach the highway here to the southwest of Yunakivka, where the Russians look to cut off the connection, the main supply line of the Ukrainian forces towards the grouping of settlements the Ukrainians have available here to the north of the forest patches. The Russians will be looking to gain control over the roads that lead up to this highway and gain control over the highway itself from the border area towards Yunakivka and onwards towards the settlements along the forest patch area before the fighting will enter the forest patches themselves. The Russians are mainly working on gaining a bridgehead across the border area with Yunakivka as the main supply hub for their forces, but also having some of these forward positions, which are the settlements just across from the forest patch area. Getting a foothold within those will allow the Russians to operate within the forest patch areas with these as forward positions just outside the forest patch area, where they can set up ATGMs and defensive positions, entrench themselves to continuously provide the forces within the forest patch areas with supplies and a defensive line. It will also allow the Russians to set up a defensive line to the west with the forest patch areas to the east, securing their bridgehead across the border area and creating a large enough buffer zone that will allow the Russians to continue offensive operations to gain control over the forest patches to the north and east of Sumy if they plan on attacking the city itself. These forest patch areas are necessary for the Russians to gain control of, to avoid the Ukrainians using guerrilla tactics to sabotage the Russian supply lines into the city itself. It will also allow the Russians to have a lot of FPV drone operators which can launch FPV drones into the city. In the Vovchansk direction, the Russians almost have full control over the northern bank of the Vovcha river line, where they have managed to secure the residential area in the central parts of Vovchansk in the northern bank of the river line. The Ukrainians still have the apartment complex area, some residential buildings in the western parts and residential buildings in the eastern parts and the northern bank of the river line. The Russians are attacking on both flanks and storming it directly head-on to gain control over the remaining parts of the northern bank of the river line within the town of Vovchansk itself. The Ukrainians also have some positions on the eastern outskirts, which the fortified positions and the remaining residential areas remain under Ukrainian control. The Russians will look to gain full control over this residential area along the river line and in between that of Vovchansk and Tychy, gaining full control, which will have a wide part of the Vovcha river line from the border area between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border and all the way to Tychy would be under Russian control, allowing them to launch offensive operations across the river line, establish a bridgehead across, or to continue the offensive operations eastwards, expanding it further along the Vovcha river line to look for any positions they can gain across the river line, expand on that, and to launch offensive operations to the southern parts of the bank in an operation to connect the Vovcha river line with the Uska river line, with potential additional crossings by the Russian forces with the large concentration of forces across the border area. To the south, along the Sirbis river line, the Ukrainians managed to advance to the south of Nadiivka. The Ukrainians have been attempting throughout this month to improve their positions here along the Sirbis river line to regain control over Serhivka and Nadia, to cut off the connection between the Russian forces to the north of these towns and the southern parts. The Russians are looking to gain control over the road connecting the towns of Stepi, Kopany, and Vishneva in the north with Rydkodob and Nova in the south, to cut off the Ukrainian forces operating east of it and to gain control over this road connecting the forces in the north and the south while the Ukrainians are attempting to destabilize the Russian positions across the Serbis river line, strengthening their positions along the river line to be able to focus their forces on both flanks, to prevent the Russians from launching head-on assaults towards their positions or to concentrate their forces on the flanks to cut off the Ukrainian forces operating near the front line. The Russians in turn managed to gain control over Ritkodub in its entirety, as we see with this geolocated footage confirming the Russian advance with the Russian flag hoisted on the western parts of the town. With full securing of Ritkodub, the Russians have gained control over both that and Nova, which allows them to establish proper supply hubs in this direction. With the river line to the west, the situation is secure in the western direction, which will allow the Russians to focus on the northern and southern flanks, where the Ukrainians have scarce positions in the south and a lot more heavily fortified and populated areas in the north, which means that the majority of the Ukrainian forces operating in the areas in the northern direction, which is also the direction the Russians want to advance in, to connect their forces in the north with the ones in the south. Therefore, we can expect the Russians to expand their offensive operations in the northern direction, but also to gain control over these scarce settlements in the south. But we cannot expect too much offensive operations in the western direction towards Losove until they have secured the surrounding settlements around Ritkodub and Tonove. In the direction of Torske, the Russians have regained control over the fish farm area in the northern parts of Torske, securing the northern supply line and securing the forward positions within the central parts of the town. The Russians will now be working on the eastern flank to resecure the fortified positions and additional supply route into the town before moving on to the southern parts and western parts in the direction of Sarishne. The Russians will here look to properly entrench themselves within Torske to prevent further Ukrainian counterattacks to destabilize the supply situation for their forces. Therefore, we can expect the advances by the Russians to be extremely slow here in the Torske direction, where they'll really be focusing mostly on defense until they can muster up enough forces to launch further offensive operations towards the southern and eastern parts of the town. In the direction of Decisive, the Russians launched a counterattack, regaining control over the fortified positions and the forest patch area in the southern flank. With control over the apartment complex area and now the southern flank, the Russians will be moving into Mykolaiivka to gain full control over the city. The Russians will look to secure Stupushki in the south, move northwards towards the southern outskirts of Decisive, move west towards Mykolaiivka, and southwest to flank the Ukrainian positions by cutting off the supply routes, which is the highway to the southwest near Stupushki, the road here south of Mykolaiivka, and Mykolaiivka itself. Gain control over the entirety of Decisive will allow the Russians to launch offensive operations towards the fortified positions and firing positions of Ukrainian artillery forces here to the northwest and southwest of the city to gain control over the northern flank of Kostyantynivka, allowing the Russians to establish positions to bombard the city with FPV drones and artillery. Moving forward, with Decisive on the high ground, Kostyantynivka itself on the low ground, the Russians would have a significant height advantage of approximately 100 to 150 meters. To the south, the Russians have advanced to the northeast of Pokrovsk, gaining control over some fortified positions here to the southeast of Rusin, cutting off the road connecting their forces from the Tu-504 highway towards Rusin, also allowing the Russians to have an additional supply route towards Rusin. The Russians are working on the fortified positions, isolating Rusin from the Tu-504 highway. And with the additional assaults towards Rusin and Poltavka, the Russians will gain full control over the fortified positions northwest of Poltavka, Rusin, and fortified positions to the east, securing the northern flank of the Tu-504 highway for further offensive operations either directly towards Stepanivka or towards the road to the north towards Dovhabelka. This is the main objective of the Russian forces, to gain control over the western flank of Kostyantynivka. Gain control over the northern and western flanks of Kostyantynivka will allow the Russians to operationally encircle the city and the entire fortified positions and settlements here to the southeast of the city, from Yablonivka to the west to Bilahora and Predichine in the east. The Russians do not need to gain control over the southern flank unless they need to storm the city directly from the southern flank. Besides that, operational encirclement would require the Russians to cut off this northern highway with their firepower, both artillery, FPV drones, and FAB bombs, which will allow them to destroy any of the vehicles the Ukrainians use to supply their forces within the city, and this will force the Ukrainians to fight another battle of Bakhmut here in the Donetsk region, just next to Bakhmut itself. The Russians are getting closer and closer to the operational encirclement of Kostyantynivka, almost surpassing the progress within the Pokrovsk direction. due to the high pace the Russians are advancing in the direction of Kostyantynivka. However, it is likely that this will slow down as the Russians get closer and closer towards the city, where the Ukrainians will have a lot of FPV drone operators. Instead, we can see that the Russians will likely look to continue their offensive operations both in the direction of Kostyantynivka and Pokrovsk to establish the fire control over both cities at the same time. The operational encirclement of both Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka at the same time will be a significant benefit for the Russian forces, as they'll have two Bakhmuts at the same time. This will prevent the Ukrainians from building up forces for a new offensive operation. At the same time, it will pin down a lot of the Ukrainian forces for Russian offensive operations towards the Dnipropetrovsk region or in the northern section of the front line, both within the Kharkiv and the Sumy regions. This will force the Ukrainians to give up some of their positions, whether it is along the northern border with Belarus and Russia, which could expose their northern flank, or to give up some of their positions in the north to secure the eastern flank, or to give up some of their positions in the east to secure the northern flanks. In general, the Russians are now numerically superior to the Ukrainian forces, which means that they will have the initiative going forward, especially since they are on the offensive. The Ukrainians barely have any positions on the Russian side of the border areas, here in the northern section of the front line, while the Russians now approximately control over 300 square kilometers. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.